When I picked up my parents to take them to the airport, they told me that they had decided to travel with my jobless sister instead of me. My mother smiled and said, "Your sister needed some rest, so we decided to take her." I remained silent, but when they arrived in Europe, they were greeted with a huge surprise. "You're late," my mother exclaimed, stepping out onto the porch and dragging her bag behind her. I looked at the clock on my dashboard. I paid for my parents to go on a lavish vacation, but they chose to take my sister instead. With 6'2" Egnam, my mother turned to me, her face too happy for the situation, and I said, "Oh, Violet, we decided Lauren should instead of you. She's been so stressed lately, and she really needs this trip." My chest tightened instead of me, "Mom, I've been planning this for years. I paid for everything." I got out of the car to help with the baggage, but my smile froze when I saw my sister Lauren emerge from the house with her suitcase. I tried to keep my voice calm. I looked at the two of them, my heart pounding in my chest, and my father walked out a little later, avoiding eye contact and giving me a suitcase. "This is unbelievable," I said, my voice shaking, "because we're grateful, sweetie, but you're always working so hard that you can take another trip later. Lauren needs this right now." Lauren didn't even have the decency to look guilty. She just smirked and shifted her weight to one hip. "Thank you for understanding, sis." As I stood in my parents' driveway, watching my sister get into the backseat of my car, I realized something I had been ignoring for years. No matter how hard I tried, Lauren was always number one in their eyes. I clenched my jaw and bit back the irate retort that was on the tip of my tongue. "It still is," my mother said, smiling, "just with Lauren. Your sister really needs a break, Violet." "My name is V. I've been working extra hours for the past 2 years to give my parents an amazing vacation, flights, luxury hotels, guided tours, and every last detail." The drive to the airport was eerily quiet. "Did you see that TikTok about Paris? I can't wait to go shopping there. Do you think we'll have time for that, or will the tours take up the entire day?" My hands tightened over the steering wheel as I stared straight ahead, forcing myself to keep quiet. My mother giggled quietly, saying, "Of course we'll have time. We'll figure it out when we get there." I forced a stiff smile before opening the trunk and let them get going, and then I muttered, "If they want to prioritize her over me, that's okay. They may accompany her." When we arrived, they didn't seem to notice that I wasn't a member of that Y anymore. At one point, my father cleared his throat and thanked me for driving us, Violet. I know this probably feels strange, but I looked at him in the rearview mirror and he didn't answer. Instead, he just shifted uneasily in his seat, possibly wishing he hadn't said anything at all. Lauren leaned forward from the back seat and said, "You're not mad, right? This is really big of you, letting me go. I could never have afforded this on my own." I clenched my mouth and forced a tight smile. Naturally, my patience had worn thin by the time we reached the airport drop-off zone, so my mom hugged me while I helped them unload their luggage. "Thank you for understanding, sweetie. This means a lot to us," Lauren, my mother, explained. I nodded stiffly, "Sure, Mom." Lauren smiled as she wheeled her bag to the entrance. "Thank you, Violet, you're the best." I stood there watching them vanish into the terminal, my chest tight with hurt and anger. The ride home was a blur, and I mentally relived the exchange, each word cutting deeper than the last. "Lauren is not angry, right? You're always working so hard." I parked in mind they could explain themselves to the front desk staff in Paris, and I was done being their doormat. The tightness in my chest started to ease as I stared at the confirmation emails piling up in my inbox. If they wanted to take Lauren instead of me, that was fine, but they refused. I sat in the car for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Then, without thinking, I marched into the house, pulled out my laptop, and logged into every travel account I'd used to book the trip. Hotel reservations were canceled, tours were reimbursed, and airline upgrades were denied. Wouldn't be staying in 5-star hotels or going on private tours on my dime. The call started as soon as their flight landed, and as I unpacked my suitcase, the one I'd packed so carefully for a trip that wasn't mine, I hung up my clothes and put my shoes back on the rack. I moaned, picked up the phone, and looked at the screen that showed my mother's name flashing along with several missed calls and texts. I'd unlock the phone and read the messages. "Violet, what's going on? The hotel won't let us check in. The reservation is missing. Call me immediately, Violet." This isn't funny. I was their fixer for years, smoothing over every mistake and picking up the slack, but no more. Eventually, I decided to answer, if only to stop the barrage of calls, and my mother's voice hit me like a tidal wave of hatred as soon as I heard it. Did they really expect me to come in and save the day after what they had done? The phone rang again, this time from Lauren, and I let it ring until she left a voicemail, Violet. Her voice was so petty that she said, "We're stuck here because of you." I rolled my eyes and deleted the voicemail without listening to the rest. I let her yell for a while before calmly answering, "What have you done?" As I picked up Violet, "The hotel claims that the reservation was canceled and that none of the trips are scheduled anymore." After a long, startled silence, she yelled, "Why would you do that?" I replied in a tone that was tinged with sarcasm, "Perhaps because you decided to go with Lauren on my trip, you're lucky that I drove you to the airport. We thought you'd understand." She snapped, Those years of saving and preparing were irrelevant because Lauren needed a break. Did you think my efforts were in vain? The calm that followed lasted barely a day, and the following morning my phone was humming again with calls and messages, which I initially ignored. I spent the day cleaning the house and catching up on work, but curiosity got the better of me, and by the evening, I had opened my phone and prepared myself for the storm of text messages from my mother, Violet. "You've gone too." "Guess what, Mom? I don't understand, and I don't want to." I hung up before she could react, and I turned off my phone and threw it on the couch. I put down the phone, shaking my head, because for years I had been the one to make things right so that everyone was comfortable and happy, and now that I had stepped back, they didn't know what to do. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table, letting the anger simmer. "Your sister is crying, your father is upset, and we can't get into any of the hotels you booked, Lauren. You're acting like a child, and I don't understand why you're making this such a big deal." After a few minutes, the next call came in, and this time I answered Violet. Before I could reply, my mother said, "This isn't amusing anymore. We are stranded." I took a leisurely sip of tea. "Do you think this is embarrassing? Try saving for years to plan every detail, and then be told you aren't even going on the trip you paid for. Stop being dramatic." She said Lauren needed this more than you, and now she can figure it out. I firmly stated, "You have made your decision, Mom. You wanted to take Lauren instead of me, which is great, but don't expect me to pay for her vacation. We're family." Another time, I laughed bitterly because I was thinking the same thing. Lauren's voice was crying in the background. "Mom, just hang up on her. She is being impossible." That was the last straw. "Enjoy your trip," I said in a frigid tone, "because it isn't your trip that was mine, and now it belongs to nobody." Felt a strange mixture of relief that I had finally stood up for myself, even though they could call me dramatic all they wanted. I allowed them to take advantage of me, and the next few days were blissfully quiet with my phone off. I was finally able to think clearly without the constant barrage of guilt trips and accusations. I spent my morning drinking coffee on my back porch, enjoying the peace and quiet I had long sought. My afternoons were spent working and finishing small projects that showed me how capable I was when I wasn't distracted by their never-ending demands. But on the third day, my curiosity got the better of me, and I checked my phone to discover more than a dozen voicemails waiting for me. The first few were from my mother, who became Violet. "I'm getting more and more upset with each one. You should call me back right now. This has gone too far. I can't believe you are doing this. You've embarrassed us. We are your parents. How could you treat us like this?" Lauren's messages, which were full of the same entitled tone she'd always used, followed. "This is so petty even for you. Just fix it, Violet." Eventually, my father's voice became lower, but no less pointed. "I don't understand what's happened to you. Call us back so we can resolve this." I paused before listening to my mother's final voicemail, which was long and full of frustration and exhaustion. I deleted the voicemails without answering because I wasn't ready to talk, and I honestly didn't know if I ever would be. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was the culmination of years of them prioritizing Lauren and expecting me to accept it with a smile. As the hours went by, I thought back on all the times I'd been ignored or dismissed, every holiday where Lauren's whims dictated the plans, every family get-together where my accomplishments were, and said, "We're back at the airport now, the trip is destroyed, and I hope you are satisfied with yourself." Treated as afterthoughts, but the cracks had been growing for years. Grace appeared suddenly that evening with 2 cups of coffee and a noticeable air of curiosity. I heard about what had happened, and she continued setting the coffee on the table. "Your mom called me yesterday." "Of course she did," she said, adding, "because my mother was always adept at enlisting sympathizers to coerce me into obedience." I asked, taking a sip, and Grace shrugged, a sly smile appearing on her face. "I told her that you were probably busy and would get back to her when you were ready." I laughed and shook my head, and she continued, "Summoning Violet's words stuck with me long after she left. Grace was right. I'd spent too much time trying to please people who didn't seem to care about my efforts. It was time to end that cycle once and for all. By the weekend, I had a strange sense of clarity. The anger was still simmering beneath the surface, but it was joined by something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom from their unending expectations, freedom from being the family's fixer, and the freedom to finally live on my own terms. The silence, however, did not last long. On a Sunday afternoon, I decided to answer my father's phone call to Violet. His voice was heavy with exhaustion, and he said, "Your mother wanted me to call because she believes you will listen to me go on." I leaned back in my chair, and he sighed, "Look, Things have gotten out of hand. Your mother is outraged. Lauren is enraged, and everything is just a mess. But you are better than this. I stiffened my words, evoking a new wave of rage that was better than what Dad. I refuse to let you walk all over me again. That's not what I meant. He answered quickly. He hesitated, and I thought he might finally understand my perspective. But then he replied, "You're punishing the entire family for one decision. Is that actually fair?" I repeated my voice, rising, and he said, "You want to talk about fairness? Was it fair that you and Mom thought I wasn't significant enough to join the trip I had planned? Was it right that you replaced me with Lauren if I didn't matter?" "That's not what we were trying to do," he added. "You're the sensible one who keeps everything together." Defensively, we simply assumed that Lauren needed it more than I did. I yelled, "You always think she requires more attention, more support, more of everything, and I am always asked to make sacrifices for her not anymore." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, and he finally muttered, "I don't know what you want me to say. I don't need you to say anything." I said, my voice firm, "I just need you to understand that I'm tired of being an afterthought. From now on, I'll come first, Dad." I put the phone down, my hands shaking, and for the rest of the day, I allowed myself to feel everything: anger, sadness, and relief. It felt like the start of something new. I wasn't going to be the family's fixer anymore, and they could figure out how to clean up their messes. When my parents and Lauren came back, I was waiting for them in their driveway, drinking coffee and feeling remarkably calm. As I watched their cab arrive, Lauren was the first to comment, "Well, I hope you're happy, Violet. Our trip was a disaster," and my mother exclaimed, waving her hand as if to dismiss the I took another sip of coffee and let their complaints watch over me. "It sounds rough, but you wanted to take Lauren, remember? I'm sure you two had a great bonding experience, but that's not the point," my mother said. "You knew we couldn't afford everything you planned. You set us up for failure. We spent the entire week sleeping in filthy hotels and eating bad food because we couldn't afford anything decent. And let's not even talk about the tours." Lauren interjected, crossing her arms, saying, "Oh, there weren't any." I got up, put my mug on the timetable next to me and said, "No, Ma, I didn't set you up for anything. I planned a trip for the three of us that was something special that I had been saving for years. You are the ones who decided to cut me out at the last minute." My father finally spoke up, his tone calmer but no less accusatory. "You didn't have to cancel everything, Violet." I asked, folding my arms, "Why should I have paid for a trip to which I hadn't even been invited?" While folding my arms. "You're lucky I didn't cancel your return flight." Lauren rolled her eyes. "It's only money, Violet, and you're so entitled that I snap back my patience now. Do you realize how much work and sacrifice went into planning that trip, or do you just think that things will work out for you because someone else looks after them?" They stood there stunned and silent for a while. I'd spent years being the responsible one, and I said in a steady but firm voice that you're the one who fixes things, prepares things, and makes sure everything runs smoothly, and you've spent just as much time taking everything for granted. "That's unfair, Mom," my mother started, but I interrupted by raising a hand. "Decided to stop being your doormat. You didn't want me on the trip, which is fine, but you don't get to enjoy the benefits of my hard work without me." I picked up my bag from the porch swing and headed out. "I'm glad you're safe, but don't expect things to get back to normal." I'm done. As I walked to my car, I heard them calling after me, their voices a mix of guilt and anger. But I didn't look back. The drive home from my parents' house felt oddly calm. For years, every visit had left me emotionally spent, but this time I felt lighter because I'd finally said everything I'd been holding in, and for once, I wasn't worried about how they would react. Cup of tea and sat on the couch, mentally reliving the confrontation. They had been so certain that I would give in as usual, but seeing their shocked faces as I left was a reminder of how much I had changed. It didn't matter if they were upset, hurt, or embarrassed. I was done living my life to satisfy their expectations. The following day, Grace called to ask how it went, and I laughed while leaning back against the kitchen counter. As you might expect, they were furious. Lauren was pouting, and Mom was probably trying to guilt me back into line. Ray snorted, "Let her try. You have a backbone now, and I'm here to keep it in place," I grinned, grateful for her unwavering support, and I said, "Thank you, Grace. You've been my rock through this." Her voice softened as she answered, "What's next for you now that you're not the family fixer?" That question had been circling in my mind for years. Since the confrontation, what was next? The choices felt endless and a little scary, but now that I've let go of that burden, I don't know yet, but I feel like I get to make the decision. Not them or anyone else, just me. It sounds like the beginning of something incredible, Grace. Over the coming weeks, I began making small changes that felt big in their own way. I redecorated my living room, replacing my parents' hand-me-down furniture with pieces that felt uniquely mine. I spent weekends exploring local cafes and parks, things I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. I also started journaling, writing down my thoughts and dreams without considering what other people might think. It felt like I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd lost until I sat down one evening and opened the spreadsheet I used to plan the trip the canceled reservation stared back at me, and instead of feeling the pang of regret, I felt a surge of resolve that the money had been intended for a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and I wasn't going to waste it. I closed the spreadsheet, opened a new tab in my browser, and typed solo travel ideas. A few weeks after my parents returned, I booked a solo trip to Italy. It wasn't the same itinerary I planned for them, and it wasn't about proving a point anymore. Rather, it was a chance for me to celebrate my independence and finally put myself first. I had never traveled alone before, but as soon as I arrived in the busy city after the airport, I knew I had made the right choice. My days were spent exploring cobblestone streets, marveling at ancient ruins, and enjoying meals at charming little cafes. I had no schedule, no one else to think about, and I was free to do anything I wanted. One afternoon, as I was enjoying a gelato on the Spanish Steps, I took out the journal I had carried with me for years. In it, I had written down my goals, but those dreams were always centered around making other people happy. As I wrote, the focus changed to learning a new language, starting a small business, and traveling to at least 5 more countries. The list expanded, with each goal reflecting the life I wanted to live, not the one that had been expected of me. My parents tried to contact me again, this time using softer tones and carefully worded messages. I hope you had a good trip. On my last night in Florence, I ate dinner at a small family-run restaurant with a view of the Arno River. As I watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, I felt a deep sense of peace. This trip had been more than just a vacation. It was a turning point in my life. I had spent so much of my life trying to gain my family's approval. But here, thousands of miles away, I realized something important. I didn't need it. I was enough. A week after my trip, my mother called, and this time I answered, "Hello, Violet." She said, "How was your trip?" "It was wonderful." I said, keeping my tone neutral, "That's nice to hear." She hesitated as if to find the right words. "We've been thinking a lot about what happened. Perhaps we handled things terribly." The admission shocked me, but I wasn't about to let her off the hook just yet. I looked at the message for a moment before putting my phone down. I wasn't ready to respond, which was fine this time, and I felt proud as I unpacked my luggage and put treasures on my shelves, replaced me on a trip that I had poorly planned and paid for. "I know she said that your dad and I didn't realize how much it would hurt you and Lauren." I asked if she felt the same way or if she was still blaming me for ruining her vacation. She said that she was upset, but I think she knew she could have handled things better. I sighed and leaned against the counter. "Mom, this wasn't just about the trip. It was about years of putting her first and expecting me to make up for it." I understand her response, but we will work to do better because we don't want to lose you. I'm glad I responded, but it will take more than words to improve this. She told me we'll give you the space you need, but I hope you'll let us back in someday. After the call, I felt a mixture of relief that they were finally acknowledging their behavior and skepticism that they would ever change. However, when I sat down with my journal that evening, I realized something crucial. Whether or not they changed was not my responsibility. For the next few months, I adhered to my strict boundaries, returning their calls and texts only when I felt like it. I didn't go out of my way to resolve conflicts or ease tensions. Instead, I concentrated on building the life I wanted. I enrolled in a photography class, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the time or energy for. I joined a local hiking group, and I even began organizing my next solo trip. One day, as I stood on my balcony and watched the sunset, I realized how far I'd come. I wasn't the person who went above and beyond for people who didn't respect me. Instead, I was someone who valued herself, set boundaries, and wasn't afraid to stand up for what she deserved. I felt completely liberated. We'd appreciate you watching, and if you haven't already, please click the notification bell to receive updates on more startling real-life stories that are happening in your area.